Have you ever wondered why salt, something so common, is mentioned so many times in Bible stories and Bible verses? It may seem surprising, but salt carries a spiritual power that goes far beyond what we have been told. It is not only a flavor-enhancing spice in food, but a secret weapon in spiritual warfare, used to purify, protect, and seal divine covenants. And the most intriguing, few know how to use it correctly to fight the forces of evil. Imagine discovering that something as accessible as salt can be the key to strengthening your faith and protecting your spiritual life. What no one has told you is that, when used with discernment, salt can transform your walk with God, bringing blessings and warding off curses. And best of all, this power is at your fingertips, waiting to be activated. The importance of salt in the Bible and its spiritual function. Salt, in the biblical stories, appears as an element loaded with deep meaning. Since antiquity, its value transcends simple culinary use. In several passages of the Bible verses, it is exalted as a symbol of purity, preservation, and covenant. Jesus, in his teachings, used salt to illustrate powerful spiritual truths, such as when he said, "You are the salt of the earth," Matthew 5:13. This shows the function of salt not only in the physical world, but also as a spiritual tool in the war against evil, purifying and preserving the essence of faith. The use of salt as a spiritual weapon may seem strange at first glance, but it is something present in the biblical tradition. When Jesus mentioned salt, he was not just referring to the condiment, but to something that has the power to transform the environment. Just as salt was used to preserve food from corruption, it is a symbol of our ability to preserve holiness in a corrupt world. It makes us reflect on how we can apply this concept in our daily lives, using salt as a constant reminder of our mission to keep our faith intact against the negative influences around us. In a spiritual war, where invisible forces act, salt serves as a symbol of protection. In the biblical stories, we see examples of how it was used to seal covenants and preserve holiness. Imagine yourself in a spiritual battle, where salt can be used in prayers or rituals to mark spiritual territory, warding off evil forces and bringing the divine presence closer. This concept opens our minds to understand that simple elements such as salt can have a much deeper meaning than we imagine. But is this the only way salt fulfills its divine purpose? The divine purpose of salt in creation. Salt, present from the beginning of creation, has a purpose that goes beyond its practical usefulness. In the Bible stories, God used salt as an integral part of the sacred rituals, as we can see in Leviticus 2:13, where it is written, "And all your meat offerings you shall season with salt." This biblical verse shows us that salt was created with a clear objective: to be an element that, when offered, would please God, sealing pacts and demonstrating the seriousness and durability of a commitment to the Lord. From the offerings in the temple to the covenants made between God and men, salt has always been present as a symbol of incorruptibility and perpetuity. When we think of the divine purpose of salt, we can understand that it is not just a simple mineral, but an element with a heavenly mission. Imagine the ancient Hebrews, who by using salt in their offerings, were not only obeying a commandment, but also enforcing the covenant with God by recognizing the need for purity and durability in their faith. In addition, salt also represents obedience and faithfulness to God's will. In a world where everything is subject to change and corruption, salt comes as a reminder that certain things must remain unchanged, such as our covenant with God. This concept makes us reflect on how we can, in our daily lives, seek that which is eternal and incorruptible, following the example of salt in its spiritual function. But what would be the role of salt when compared to other elements of purification in the Bible? Salt, as a symbol of purification and preservation. Salt, in Bible stories, is often mentioned as a symbol of purification and preservation, playing a unique role in both the physical and spiritual worlds. In 2 Kings 2:21, for example, the prophet Elisha cleansed the waters of a city by throwing salt into them, saying, "Thus says the Lord, I have made these waters clean. Death and barrenness shall no longer proceed from here." This Bible verse highlights the power of salt to bring renewal and life where there was once destruction, reinforcing its role as an agent of purification. Compared to other purification elements like fire and water, salt offers a different and equally powerful perspective. While fire consumes and water washes, salt purifies and preserves, maintaining the integrity of what is pure. In spiritual practice, salt can be used to mark spaces, protect the home, or even be a physical reminder of the need to keep one's spiritual life preserved and free from the corruption of the world. Imagine using salt, for example, in a prayer ritual, symbolizing the continuous purification and preservation of faith. The function of salt goes beyond just purifying. He also preserves that which is sacred. In a world where everything is transitory, salt teaches us about the importance of keeping alive the essence of what is good and pure. When thinking about how salt was used to preserve sacred offerings or to purify cursed waters, we are led to reflect on how we can apply this preservation to our lives while keeping our faith and values unchanged. But how does salt relate to the testimonies of those who use it in their faith practices? Testimonies and practical applications of the use of salt in the Bible stories has been a powerful spiritual tool, and many have testified to its effectiveness in their faith practices. In several passages of the Bible verses, we see the use of salt as a symbol of protection and purification, and this tradition lives on today. For example, some people report that by using salt in their prayers, they feel a stronger presence of God, as if the physical act of spreading salt around their homes or at specific times of intercession strengthens their spiritual barriers against evil. A practical example of the use of salt can be found in the everyday lives of many believers who use this mineral as a tangible symbol of their faith. They can, for example, put salt in the corners of their homes to protect the environment from negative spiritual influences, or dissolve it in water and use this solution to purify objects and places that they consider sacred. These gestures, although simple, carry a deep spiritual charge, referring to the biblical tradition of using physical elements to strengthen faith. It is interesting to note that these testimonies of salt use connect with the experience of so many throughout history. By sharing their own experiences, people not only strengthen their faith, but also encourage others to explore the power of salt in their spiritual lives. This leads us to think about how salt, such a common element, can have such a profound and lasting impact on our faith journey. But what can we learn about the historical role of salt and its spiritual relevance throughout the ages? The role of salt in ancient history and its spiritual relevance. Since ancient times, salt has played a crucial role, not only in the preservation of food, but also as a symbol of covenant and purity in the biblical stories. In ancient Rome, salt was so valuable that it was used as a bargaining chip, and this practice was reflected in the respect that the cultures of that time had for it. In the Bible verses, salt was an essential element in the offerings made in the temple, a symbol of enduring covenant and spiritual commitment. This heritage lives on in Christianity, where salt is seen as a symbol of purification and spiritual protection. The use of salt in antiquity, especially in religious rituals, points to its continued spiritual relevance. When we observe how salt was used to seal covenants between God and men, as in the offerings of the Old Testament, we realize that it represented the permanence and faithfulness of the divine covenant. Imagine the early Christians who, by using salt, not only preserved food, but also reaffirmed their faith and the spiritual protection it symbolized, constantly reminding themselves of the purity required by God. The tradition of using salt as a spiritual symbol transcends cultures and times, finding its place in various religious practices to this day. Its relevance is not limited to the past, but continues to be a powerful reminder of our need to preserve our faith and keep our spiritual covenants intact. This continuity makes us reflect on how, over the centuries, salt has maintained its importance, both historically and spiritually. But how can we demystify erroneous beliefs and negative myths that have arisen around the use of salt? Refuting myths and negative beliefs about salt. Throughout history, salt, so present in the biblical stories and biblical verses, ended up being the target of several negative beliefs and myths. Some cultures over the centuries have associated salt with witchcraft or pagan practices, distorting its true spiritual purpose. However, when we look at the Bible, we see that salt is actually a symbol of purity, covenant, and preservation, used in a sacred way to seal covenants and protect what is holy. It is important, therefore, to distinguish between the proper spiritual use of salt and the superstitions that have arisen around it. These myths often cause confusion and even fear in some people who avoid the use of salt in their faith practices for fear of getting involved in something negative. However, it is essential to remember that Jesus used salt as a powerful metaphor to describe the lives of believers, saying, "You are the salt of the earth." Matthew 5:13. This reflects the importance of salt as something that brings value and purpose to our spiritual walk, away from any negative connotations. Unraveling these myths is an important step in rescuing the use of salt according to its true biblical purpose. Instead of fearing salt because of myths, believers should see it as a divine gift, a tool from God to protect and purify. By refuting these erroneous beliefs, we make room to understand the true spiritual power that salt carries, as described in Scripture. This understanding allows us to use salt wisely and faithfully, without fear, but with the assurance that it is a vital part of the spiritual arsenal that God has given us. Now let's explore the biblical examples that show salt being used as a spiritual tool. Bible examples of the use of salt as a spiritual tool. Bible stories are filled with examples that illustrate the power of salt as a spiritual tool. One of the most striking accounts is in 2 Kings 2:21, where the prophet Elisha purifies the waters of Jericho by pouring salt into them, declaring, "Thus says the Lord, I have made these waters clean. Death and barrenness shall no longer proceed from here." This Bible verse highlights the use of salt not only as a physical element, but as a means of manifesting divine power, transforming a source of curse into a source of life and blessing. Another significant example can be found in the salt offerings mentioned in Leviticus 2:13. Here God instructs that every grain offering should be seasoned with salt, symbolizing the incorruptibility and purity that should characterize all that is offered to him. This simple act of adding salt to offerings illustrates how salt serves to seal a covenant of faithfulness between God and his people. Thus, salt becomes more than a seasoning. He is a symbol of something eternal and unchanging, a constant reminder of the covenant between the divine and the human. These examples invite us to reflect on how we can apply the use of salt in our spiritual lives today. Just as Elisha purified the waters, we can use salt in our prayers and rituals to bring healing, protection, and purification into our own environments. In doing so, we are following in the footsteps of the prophets and men of faith, who came before us using salt as a tool to manifest God's power in our lives. But what else can we learn about the symbolic depth of salt, especially in relation to the Salt Alliance, the Salt Covenant, symbol of perpetuity and fidelity? The Salt Covenant mentioned in the Bible stories is one of the deepest and most enduring symbols of the relationship between God and man. In Numbers 18:19 we read, "All the high offerings of holy things, which the children of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and to your sons and to your daughters with you for an everlasting statute. It is a perpetual covenant of salt before the Lord." This Bible verse highlights salt as an emblem of an everlasting covenant, representing the incorruptibility and faithfulness that should characterize our relationship with God. The choice of salt as a symbol of perpetuity is not by chance. Just as salt preserves food by keeping it free from corruption, it symbolizes the durability of God's promises and the need to maintain our faithfulness to Him. As we reflect on the Salt Covenant, we understand that God expects our commitment to Him to be as permanent as the covenant represented by salt. It is a call to live a life of faithfulness, knowing that just as salt preserves, our covenant with God must be preserved above all things. This covenant invites us to live in a way that our actions reflect the incorruptibility that salt symbolizes. By understanding the profound meaning of the salt covenant, we are inspired to renew our commitment to God daily, ensuring that our faith is always pure and our devotion eternal. This concept leads us to consider the strength of salt not only in terms of preservation, but also in its ability to bless and curse, as we will explore in the next point. The use of salt in contexts of curse and blessing. In the biblical stories, salt appears not only as a symbol of covenant and purification, but also as a powerful element of blessing and curse. A classic example is found in Judges 9:45, where Abimelech, after conquering the city of Shechem, sowed salt on it, symbolizing a curse that would make the land infertile. This act shows us that salt, in addition to purifying and preserving, can also be used to seal curses, representing the destruction and sterility of everything that is not aligned with God's will. On the other hand, salt also carries a blessing power. We see this in Jesus' words in Mark 9:50, "Have salt in yourselves and peace with one another." Here, Jesus uses salt as a metaphor for purity and peace, encouraging believers to keep their lives seasoned with divine goodness and wisdom, bringing blessings wherever they are. This dual use of salt as an element of blessing and curse teaches us about its strategic role in spiritual warfare, where it can be used to both protect and correct. These examples invite us to reflect on how salt can be applied in our spiritual lives, both to bring blessings and to ward off that which is harmful. By using it in prayers, rituals, or simply as a physical symbol in our homes, we can align ourselves with God's purpose, asking Him to bless our actions and remove any curse or negative influence. This understanding leads us to further explore the role of salt as a powerful weapon in spiritual warfare, a topic that we will address below. Salt as a weapon in spiritual warfare. Salt, in the biblical stories, is more than a simple mineral. It is a powerful weapon in spiritual warfare. In Matthew 5:13, Jesus declares, "You are the salt of the earth," indicating that believers are to exert a purifying and preserving influence in a world filled with corruption. This Bible verse reveals to us that salt is not just a symbol, but an active tool that we can use in our spiritual lives to combat the forces of evil. Just as salt has the power to preserve what is good, it can also be used to repel what is evil. In spiritual practice, salt can be used in a variety of ways to strengthen faith and combat negative influences. For example, many people put salt in doors and windows as a form of spiritual protection, creating a barrier against any harm that tries to enter their homes. Others use salt in prayer rituals, asking God to purify their environments and hearts. These practices, rooted in ancient traditions, reflect the belief that salt is an effective weapon against the unseen forces that seek to bring us down. In addition to its practical use, salt also serves as a constant reminder of our identity and mission as believers. By utilizing it in our prayers and rituals, we are reminded that we are engaged in a constant spiritual battle, where every act of faith, no matter how small, has a significant impact. Thus, by understanding and applying the use of salt in spiritual warfare, we equip ourselves with a powerful tool that can transform our lives and protect us from the influences of evil. But how has salt been seen and used in different cultures around the world? Pacts with salt in Eastern cultures and their spiritual symbology. In Bible stories and in various Eastern cultures, salt has been a symbol of commitment and loyalty, used in pacts that transcend time. In many of these cultures, the act of sharing salt between two parties sealed important agreements, indicating that the covenant would be lasting and incorruptible. This use of salt reflects a deep understanding of its spiritual symbology, where it not only preserves the integrity of food, but also the integrity of the agreements made under its influence. A notable example of this practice can be found in the Middle East, where to this day, salt is used in pacts and hospitality rituals. By offering salt to a guest, the host not only ensures protection and peace during the visit, but also seals a commitment of friendship and fidelity. This custom, which echoes biblical practices, reminds us that salt is not just a spice, but a powerful symbol of spiritual and moral bonding. By understanding this symbology, we can apply salt in our own lives, not only in rituals, but also as a symbol of commitment in our relationships. These salt pacts teach us that salt is much more than a mineral. It is an emblem of trust and fidelity that crosses cultures and times. When we use salt in our spiritual practices, we are connecting to a long tradition of loyalty and commitment, reinforcing the spiritual bonds we maintain with God and others. However, when using salt, it is crucial to remember that it is a divine tool and not an object of worship, which leads us to the discussion about the correct use of salt, avoiding idolatry. Exhortation to the correct use of salt. Avoiding idolatry. Salt, so present in the Bible stories and Bible verses, is a spiritual tool of great power, but it is vital to remember that it should not be idolized. Like the bronze serpent that Moses lifted up in the wilderness, salt can easily become an object of worship if we are not careful. In 2 Kings 18:4, we see that Hezekiah had to destroy the brazen serpent because the people began to burn incense to it. This serves as a clear warning to us. Salt, while powerful, is only a symbol, a means by which God works, and should not replace the Creator in our hearts. As we use salt in our spiritual practices, we must do so with discernment, recognizing that it is a tool, not a talisman. Salt should be a reminder of our covenant with God, of our purity and spiritual preservation, but never an object of veneration. Unfortunately, in some cases, we see people attributing to salt an almost mystical power, forgetting that true power comes from God, and that salt is only a physical representation of this spiritual power. This error can lead us away from the true faith and lead us to deception. Therefore, it is essential to maintain a balanced and correct perspective on the use of salt. We must use it as God has guided us, always with the awareness that our faith and worship must be directed only to Him. Salt can be a powerful aid in our spiritual walk, but it must be treated with the proper respect and understanding so that we do not fall into the error of idolatry. And with this perspective, we can conclude our reflection on salt and invite you to continue this spiritual journey with purpose and intention. Throughout this journey, we have seen how salt, present in so many Bible stories and Bible verses, is more than just a mineral. It symbolizes purification, protection, and an enduring covenant with God. But now, the real question is, how are you going to apply this in your life? Salt can be a powerful tool for strengthening your faith and protecting your spiritual environment. Are you ready to incorporate this practice into your walk with God? Use salt with purpose, always remembering that it is a representation of God's power, not an object of worship. By applying it in your prayers and in your daily life, you will be renewing your commitment to the Lord. Now I ask you, what will you do with this knowledge? If you want to continue learning and strengthening your spiritual life, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share your experiences. Let's grow together in faith.